Hello, Scott and Laura, and welcome back to the A World of Difference podcast.
Thanks for
Good to see
having
you
us.
again, Lori. Thank you. Yeah.
Super exciting to have you both on here again, and also announcing your new book that's coming out, which a lot of people have been waiting for. A follow up to A Church Called Tove, which is what you were speaking about the last time you were here on the podcast. And this book has done so much good. It's made such a difference in my life, but in the lives of many people listening to this podcast and so many people around the world that have read it and engaged with it. So we're all super excited that there's a book coming out now called Pivot, where you're kind of going a little deeper into some of the questions you've been getting in the aftermath of this book. So I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but to just share a little bit of the overview of what Pivot's about and how it continues this conversation around abuse in the church.
You want me to share, Dad?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, so in the months and I should say weeks, months, years following the publication of A Church Called Tove, we were getting questions that became more frequent. People would read Tove and it gave them a language and helped them maybe identify some of the red flags or toxic patterns that they might see in their church or their organization. And more frequently, my dad and I were getting asked, well, what do we do? How do we transform a culture? Or I'm a lay person. Is there anything I can do? Or what red flags should we look for? Another one was, we really like a church called Tove and we want to have a Tove church. How do we transform our culture to make it good? And that's really how the book started, is whereas Tove, our friend Steve Carter says, Tove is more the what, the problem. Pivot is more the, okay, how do we fix it? And so it's our best attempt to answer those questions that we had been getting frequently.
Yeah. And when we wrote the Tove book, we were concerned with marks of toxicity that we were finding in institutions, churches, even businesses. We've had some business people contact us about toxicity in the workplace. And I, of course, because I teach at an institution, I'm sure Laura has to do this. We have to take, go through workplace programs on the computer to go through all this stuff and learn about it. It's everywhere. Everybody needs to be aware of these things. So we found some marks of toxicity, and we were asking ourselves at that time, what would be the opposite? So let's say the moral Christian alternative to these toxic workplaces and toxic churches. So that's where we came up with the marks of Tove, which is the Hebrew word for good and goodness. So then, churches are sort of places where they want to fix things. This is what they're supposed to do, So we get a lot of questions of what can we do, and we were sort of like, well, read our book. But over time, we began to think about what would be the steps that someone would have to go through to actually transform a toxic church or a toxic workplace. And we had some ideas, of course, and I was teaching on it in my classes with pastors who had ideas. But I had a student in the back of my class who, like, this is an intensive all day long, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And like on Tuesday or Wednesday, he says, I have something to say here. And he's auditing. He said, I did a PhD in organizational transformation. I went, oh boy, oh boy. And he made a really funny remark. He said, Lori says to me, you have all the right ideas, but all the wrong words. It's because I was using theological terms all the time. So he told me about a book by Edgar Schein on organizational transformation and psychology and leadership. And then I found out that I had an old friend who taught with Edgar Schein at MIT. And he said he's the real deal. And so Laura and I both read this book very carefully. And that helped us sort of craft some of the organization for the book. But the really oddest thing about this book as we wrote it was, I don't know how many times I thought to myself, but I said this to Laura numerous times. I think every chapter could be the first chapter. It was that sort of book where this theme is important. It could lead to this, or you could start here and it would lead to that. And so we had a little bit of trouble finding the organization that we thought would work. And we had a really nice editor who helped us
It was
sort these things
wonderful.
out. So now we have
Hmm.
priorities, practices, and the powers of
Yes. Three P's.
transforming your, yeah,
Yes.
3P.
Great
Make,
alliteration. Yep. You stuck with all
make,
that churchiness, didn't you?
makes us a Baptist, doesn't it?
That's right. That's basically going to be in the new Baptist Faith and Message Amendment. I'm pretty sure. I heard that. I'm just kidding. Yeah, 3 P's. Definitely easy to remember and helpful. And I think that when things are hard and confusing and you are being either gaslit or abused on a church staff or a business, Christian business, or any business, it can be helpful to have things in your brain that stick there because it's so hard to navigate when you're in a toxic culture. And so I know that you've heard so many stories people who've come to you after a church called Tove. And this book is another act of love where you're using your brain and you're really researching and you're connecting with people and organizational understanding of how organizations can pivot indeed, but also bringing in the church experience that's very specific in this way is really helpful. I think that Scott, you and I last interview we had, which was about your New Testament translation, and you were mentioning Darvo, which is this concept a lot of us know now. But when we think about that, this whole deny and deny that the abuser did anything wrong, the A is like you attack the person that's actually being abused, and then that's sort of the gaslighting part of it all. And then the reversing victim and offender is the part that just really, unfortunately, works really well. And that's why it is used so often. So as people are reading a church called Tove, they're still navigating a lot of them, this Darvo, and it's hard. And it's some of the things I know people were reading in a church called Tove. It's like, yeah, I want to make these changes, but how? So here's your book and about the 3 P's. So walk us through. You've got priorities, practices, and powers. Who wants to talk about those, or do you want to split them up? You don't have to ruin anything in the book. I want people to buy your book, but just like high level, what are you talking about with these priorities, practices, and powers?
First thing that we have to ask Lori is, when you hear the word pivot, what do you think of?
COVID.
No, that's good. It's good. It's good. No, it's something from some TV show. What is it?
Oh,
Okay, so when my dad pitched this title Pivot, I said, Dad, you cannot name this book Pivot. That's the famous Friends episode with the couch where they're trying to get the
pivot.
couch up the stairs and Ross is shouting, Pivot, pivot.
Oh, right.
And being a theologian that he is, he's like, I've never seen that episode. I don't even know what show you're talking about. And I said, it's really a famous show. So we went back and forth about that.
It's so true, but it's a great name. I like the name.
Yes.
Well, I'll talk about the priorities, but I mean we can probably each take one. I don't know if Laura has it organized, outlined in front of her, but in a sense there were like 8 or 9 topics in the Pivot book, and we can organize them by priorities. And we think that this is really important. In the business world, I think it's Peter Drucker who says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, or something like this. And as we were doing the Tove book, I became convinced that character eats culture before it eats strategy for breakfast. So I thought character is such an important topic, and it determines the kind of culture that happens. So it's not, culture just doesn't happen. Something has to be at work to form a culture, and it will be the virtues and the character. So we think that one of the most important things that has to happen in toxic workplaces, toxic cultures, toxic churches, institutions, is for a revolution of what matters most, and that is a concentration on character development in the people involved. And this is this is odd to say, but in churches, this is a revolution because instead of focusing on individual character development, churches work on productivity and numerical increase. You know, the bees, I think we learned some of this from Steve Carter. Bills in the plate, butts in the pew, bills in the plate, baptisms in the water, and then I added one, buildings on the campus. Those are the measurements that we use. And we think that Christian institutions, moral institutions, need to start focusing on character. And this used to be.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I feel like this goes far beyond churches too. I work in the field of education. We hire for skill.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up having, in the case of Willow Creek, you have, and everywhere really, you have really skilled people, but they don't have the character sometimes to match their skill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Skill, yeah, and skill is productive. That's the problem with it. So we wanted to focus on character, and we have some things in the book that help people just sort of take character tests and where you can go online to find these things. And but I also think that this is really it really is going to upset the apple cart. So the book that we told the story of to begin with is in California with Mike Lucan and Kent Carlson when they were there. Oak Hill, right, Laura? Oak Hill.
Oak Hills.
Yeah, Oak Hills. And they transformed a mega church based on the Willow Creek model that was doing extremely well. It was popular and lines of people wanting to talk to whoever spoke on the platform that weekend at the end of every service. They decided to focus on Dallas Willard's ideas of transformation. So they quickly reduced their church in about a half and the budget in about half.
The staff were totally confused because they were hired to produce for their skill.
Yeah.
And they were, and the two pastors were fumbling their way forward as they were trying to figure out how to do this. As Mike told me, he said, I wish we had your book before we started. I thought, I wish we'd written the book before you started too, but we didn't know anything about it then. So character is one of the most important things that we think should be emphasized in institutions.
Yeah.
The second one, I don't know, this is kind of my topic, is power. How every institution, every church has power. People have power. They have authority. Authorized power is authority. And how you use power really matters in a culture and in a church, in an institution, in a business. And we break it down into 4 prepositions, I think. Maybe it's 3. I go back and forth, depends on which ones I remember. And that is power over is sort of domination, is that people say, I can tell you what to do and I'm going to tell you what to do. And if you don't like it, you can leave. You know, that's the power. That sounds like football, military.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is power with, and that is when people have the virtue. Well, no, power to is second. That's the influence. You have to recognize that your power to influence people is important. And you don't want to use the power over, but you do have the power to influence. Then a power with is where you're willing to move sideways on the platform, allow someone else to be on the platform, or to have other people at the table who make decisions or share leadership in genuine ways. And then the fourth one is power four, and that is to use your power for the good of someone else, to empower them to do what they do. So we really believe that power is one of the priorities that institutions need to start considering much more seriously if they want to transform a culture.
So good. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is really about character. I hear this so often. And I love, Laura, that you mentioned that it's not just a conversation in the church. Certainly, it is an issue in the church and all faith based spaces, but you work in education, I work in business. Character can make or break a business or a person's career. And, we're seeing that happen sometimes even here in Silicon Valley. You'll hear things. I don't want to mention any names, but but how character, affects it can affect a lot of people's lives. If you're a CEO of a big, social media company, for example, and how you treat people really matters. How you treat your employees. Do you listen? Listening is something I work in leadership and development at a global tech company, and our first monthly manager call that I arranged recently with our 300 people that are involved in this call is, let's work on listening. This is a skill for the next month. We did a Harvard Business Review video that we watched together. There's different ways to listen. We're practicing listening with each other. In a way, it's not rocket science, but it's hard, and it's not the kind of thing you typically talk about first. You talk about, like you said, Scott, it's like if it's a church context, it's like the butts and seats, the baptisms, the bucks, the buildings, the campus. But in business, it's also about profit and sales and products and that kind of thing. But if it's, there's a lot of conversation right now about AI, right? For example, and we're seeing this
Mm-hmm.
happen in the strikes that are going on with the writer's strike and the actors, right? It's like, well, ethically, we could just let AI do everything, but it's not ethical to human beings for us to go that route completely, and in business, the way we talk about it is we need to learn to use AI to help us, but we are empathetic human beings. We are emotional human beings, and emotion is good, and it can be used for evil or good. And so, as we're creating these emotionally healthy environments, that's not something we can rely on robots or people who act like robots to do well. We need character, we need people first. And so, as you've been writing this book, what are some practical steps or strategies that church leaders in particular can implement to create these safer, emotionally healthy cultures where there's psychological safety for people?
Assess where you're at. We found that to be, I think we learned that from Shine, from some of the research. I don't remember where we learned it, but we learned it somewhere. And it became really, we felt essential to the process of any sort of transformation or character growth was for individuals and at the team level, the organization level, to assess where they're at. So in our book, Pivot, we developed a I don't know what you would call it. It's an assessment. It's not statistically normed or anything like that, but it goes through our circle of Tove, like people first, justice, empathy, truth telling, and it allows individuals to assess where the organization is. So Shine is really big on, you have to know what the problem is before you can just charge forward with any sort of transformation. And you have to be specific about it. So organizations might be able to take the churches might be able to take our Tove, we call it the Tove tool, and they might find, okay, we're really good at being empathetic. People feel safe here, but this is an area like, let's say, justice, where we're not so great. We've scored low, and really, sometimes confronting our own character is the hardest of all. It's really going to take vulnerability and a willingness to listen, but that has revealed itself to be an essential step in the process, is knowing where you are and where you've been before you can move forward.
It's good. Do you find, as you've been working with churches, because I know you've probably been asked to consult with different churches in this process in the time since you wrote Tove, Um, do you find that a lot of churches reach out, but they're really not serious about it? It's almost like a game, and they're not serious about doing that deep listening work and really assessing where they've been and being honest. Is that common or not common?
Well, I've tried to avoid becoming a church consultant. Uh, that's a business, and I'm a professor, and Laura's a public school teacher, so it can get pretty intense. But um, more than a few times, I have had letters from pastors and leaders who say they're working on Tove when I know they just want the right message to be out there rather than. Um, I really don't think there are many churches that could use the Tove tool. And I think there's 7 separate sections. Is that right, Laura? 7 sections? I think it is.
However many are in the circle of Tove, that's
Yeah, 7.
Yeah.
If you do one of these a month in let's just say, some kind of safe small groups, let's say you have 50 employees and you get 10 little groups of 5, and they each go through these in a safe way so that they can say what they think and no one's going to fire them for what they think. I don't think there's any institution that won't come up short on a few of these categories. And those are some things then that those organizations, those churches, institutions, whatever, can begin working on something that can make a difference in their organization. And so we think that these will be conversation starters in the Tove tool and, let's say, discomforting revelations of some practices and some habits that are in need of some attention. But I also think it's unlike what you're going to get in the business world. It's not going to be quite like that. It's, in a sense, it's too moral for the typical business world, which is going to be a little bit more boilerplate type stuff because you can't get too specific sometimes. So I think it can really help.
To answer your question, Art, so the Tove tool isn't out yet. We haven't had, it comes out with the book. It's part of the book. So we haven't had churches use it yet. And I'm really hopeful about hearing about those conversations. But we have met with a number of church, like a church. I'm thinking of a church plant. I'm thinking of a Canadian church that we had a meeting with. I'm thinking of Zacharias Ministries. We met with them. Typically, the people that ask to meet with us see toxic patterns and are asking for help.
Yeah, right. And are they typically people that can make a change? Because I think that's always the difficult part, right? You might have a staff member who has a lead pastor who's, whatever version of narcissism on that spectrum that he might lie, and they're, when you're dealing with that, you just get fired in retaliation for, like, that happened to me, right? So you can't call it out without experiencing retaliation. So are people that reach out to you often the decision makers or just the ones that notice it, do you think?
Well, I think it varies, and maybe Laura has something else to add here. I think in general, it's people who see the problem and want to do something about it and are looking for process, procedures, steps. What can we do to, let's say, you've been involved in this at a very serious level. What can we do to make this known, to make it clear? What can we do to convince these people that this is a problem? That's the one that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And what can we do to help transform the culture? So, like we've met with some pretty high powerful people in organizations who were still below, let's say, the board and the president.
Yeah.
A lot of these are one person president founders. They make the decisions. And until that person is convinced that there's need for something to change, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, that's the frustrating part for so many people, isn't it? I really do hope that your book gets read by people who are starting to be more self-aware. I know that, Chuck DeGroat's been on the podcast, and I know that when you're dealing with narcissism, it's a whole other thing. And a lot of therapists won't even treat people with narcissistic personality disorder because they just don't see a lot of results of things changing. And that can feel really hopeless, both for people on a staff working with somebody like that. And I think, betrayal blindness it's a real thing. The same person who coined the term Darvo talks a lot about that as well. And it's something that a lot of people grow up, and your wife, Chris, we should bring her in for this part of the conversation because she's the psychologist. But I mean, people who've grown up in households where they had to use betrayal blindness to survive, because to admit something was going wrong meant they would be out on the street. And in often cases of domestic violence, that's what's going on with a spouse. That's like, to confront this fact that the person is abusing me means I will lose everything. And being on a church staff can feel similar. You'll lose your whole faith community. You'll lose your income. You'll lose where your kids go to youth group. And so I know that you've faced that with people. And so betrayal blindness is something we use to protect ourselves. And it also is something that victims, as they come out, walk through a lot of shame about, like, why didn't I notice it sooner? But there's so much psychology around it. But I really do hope that, for me, I was coming out of that betrayal blindness when I picked up a church called Tove, and it's what helped me see. There were so many words in there. So I'm really hoping Pivot will do that for people who are open to the possibility that something's going wrong and that they can make a difference either for themselves or others, or both. As you've done your research and your interviews, is there any story in particular that stood out to you that you just think would inspire us to want to make a difference in this area? And it could be a story that ended well or one that didn't end well. Either way, I think that either we can be inspired by either one of those to bring change. But do either one of you have a story from your experience of Tove and writing this book that you think is helpful for us?
The story of Oak Hills comes to my mind right away. I think so. Long ago, when we were writing Pivot, my dad had this book sent to my house. Well, first he had this huge Edgar Schein research book sent to my house. It was like this, it was thick. And then he sent me a beautiful little book called Renovation of the Church. And I had never heard of it before. I had never heard of these co-pastors, Mike Lucan, Kent Carlson, but it became the central case study and focus of Pivot, because they came to Willow Creek actually for a conference, and went back to their church in Folsom, California, Oak Hills, and they created an attractional model based on what they had learned at Willow Creek. And they're not critical of Willow Creek. In fact, they said it worked. We had thousands of people in attendance. Well, as weeks and months and years went on, they started to feel increasingly agitated, like in their spirit. And they felt like our model of doing church is actually doing the opposite. It's not tending to people's souls. We have created consumers, and we put on a great service, and then they called it like a monster in the basement. And then the monster needs to be fed, and the people want an even better service next weekend. So I could keep going, because that story just, it really has stood out as they paid attention to what the spirit was stirring in their soul, and they surrendered to it, and ended up, we tell the whole story in Pivot, or you can just read their book, Renovation of the Church. They changed their entire way of doing church. And like my dad mentioned at the beginning, it was really hard. The staff was completely confused. They lost half of their congregation, because the congregation didn't want to come to learn how to learn about Jesus and what he taught. They wanted a show, and it was painful. But at the end, they would say it was worth it, because we did what we felt we were called to do, and they felt like they just felt so uncomfortable with what they had become.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree with what Laura's saying. I think that church experience with Oak Hills is a real good example of what goes on. Um, here's something that needs to be learned, and this is from that. I learned this first from that student who was in the back of my class, and he said one of the things you need to know about organizational transformation is when the leaders and the workers are committed to transformation, change of an institution. It takes 7 years to transform the culture, and I would say this is really important for whatever organization is thinking of making some radical changes. To we actually distinguish between change, shift, and transformation. And so transformation is at the deepest level. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be very painful. It's going to be hard. And you're going to have to get ownership from the top down and from the bottom up. And a lot of churches, my experience, is they work from the top down. Some visionary entrepreneurial leader has the idea, and then we want to implement it. And of course, the next year they got another idea. This is how mega churches work, isn't it?
It sounds like
Is they're always trying to recreate things and do this.
adapting the curriculum.
Yeah.
What we learned is you have to build a coalition. To build a coalition, you have to have, let's just say, someone who's a leader of the whole vision. But then that person has to have conversations with other people to start building a coalition. To build a coalition, though, you have to have the skill of not only listening, but learning, and learning together, so that let's say now you've moved this to 12 people. Are they all invested in this now because they contributed, or have you persuaded them to go along with what you want? Mm-hmm. If it's the persuasion model, it's not going to happen. But if you work with a coalition and build out small groups, bigger, eventually get to where you're actually going into the entire system. That's going to take a long time to build ownership. I talked to a pastor who told me that he did not go to the congregation for 5 years. It was 5 years of on-ramp work to work with different people in the church and to listen to one another, to build the kind of shift and transformation that they wanted to do. So we have some ideas of how things can happen, but this isn't a cookie cutter. If you drop down this video, you're going to have, you can't do a video at work on sexual abuse and eliminate sexual perverts in your in your workplace. That's not going to change them like that. This is a long-term process. So there's a lot of work that's involved here.
Yeah, it is. And I'm so glad that you're emphasizing that point, because I think that some of the cultures that are maybe sort of the target audience for this book are the very ones who want a quick and easy fix. And, the mega church model that churns out services, and every week's a new week, and it might be a completely different situation of a whole new curriculum. But at the same time, it's not about the next biggest hit that we're addicted to. It's about deep work that walks through shame, and it does repair, takes Yom Kippur seriously, like you mentioned, in a church called Tove. And it's gritty and it's messy and it's not flashy and glitzy and filled with a foggy stage. It's something very different. And so thank you for this work. It is so important. I have great optimism that it's going to do all kinds of wonderful things. And it's going to also probably create a third book out there, because then there's going to be new questions that come out.
No more. Don't encourage Laura.
You've got 3 Ps. I mean, it would feel strange to not have a third at this point. Anyway, just thank you so much to you both. I know that you have whole other lives and careers and families, but you would take time to write a book like this to help make a difference. It really means a lot to me and to so many of us that I know that are going to read it and learn more information about how we can make a difference together. I really just hope people buy this book, and I'm going to give you the opportunity just to say, where's the best place to buy it? Where can people find you and your writing and follow more of what you're both doing?
We have
Go
a
ahead, Laura.
website, churchcalledtove.org. Everything is linked on it. The new book, the old book.
Perfect.
And we both have Twitter. Do you have Twitter, Laura?
Yes.
You still have Twitter? Yeah.
For now.
I have Twitter.
Yeah.
Hey, I have Threads.
I do too.
I have Threads.
I love it
I
there.
have
It's
Threads.
much kinder.
I'm not sold on Threads. There's pieces of it that I just don't like as much as Twitter. It is nicer.
No, definitely.
People are nice.
Yes, that's the part I like. Yeah.
I like that I was early on Threads.
Yes.
And then I have Twitter.
You were. You sent me an invitation, Dad. I thought,
Yeah,
whoa.
that's pretty.
Lori, make sure you put that on the air that I sent her the invitation.
Scott's the tacky one in this family. Yeah.
No, I'm not. Definitely
No,
not.
yeah.
That. But and then we have, I have a Substack.
Yes.
So
Of course. Which
type
we
my
love.
name in Substack, and then that's where it pops up. We don't have. I'm not using the blog at Christianity Today. I think they're going to eliminate blogs. So that was the plan. So.
Well, your Substack is awesome. I love it. So thanks
Thank
for
you.
doing that and keeping us connected with other authors and all the ways that you do that there. Yes. So check out all these things. Go to the website. We'll link everything in the show notes. And we're ending this main interview for now. But for those of you who are in a difference maker community, you'll get an extra little exclusive one question mini-sode that we'll do with them. So thanks for being on the show today, Scott and Laura, and for this book. And I just hope it does make a huge difference everywhere that it lands.
Thank you for having us again. It was nice to see you.
You're welcome.